Hello, my name is Bob Ganzak, and this is MotivationU the Podcast. Good morning. My name is Bob Ganzak. This is MotivationU the Podcast, coming to you live from the Coach's Podcast Room here at Spurrier's Gridiron Grill at Celebration Point. Yes, with all of our helmets behind us, and it's a Gator game day and having a great time. With me today is a friend. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not even going to say that you're a graduate of the Dale Carnegie class.
Which
I'm just going to say your friend, Chris Qualmann from Meldon Law. And I am so happy to have you here. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. You know, we were talking before we got started. This is a role reversal for us. I've interviewed you several times, and now the shoe's on the other foot.
Definitely. We discussed this 3 times. I've been on the Meldon podcast, Meldon Law Podcast,
Right.
with Jeffrey and Carrie and Chris. And one time on your radio show,
That's right.
on a Saturday morning, I think it was
10:30 every Saturday morning over at SKY.
I came into town for that, and now I've got you onto this side of the fence.
It's different, you know, in force of habit, I bring notes. And normally as the interviewer, you bring notes, but as the interviewee, I'm just not accustomed to this role reversal, so bear with me a little bit here.
All right. So today's program, if you'd like to send in questions, you can go to Facebook Live. We're actually on like 39 or 36 different places, Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook Live. Wherever you find your podcast, we'll be there. MotivationU the Podcast.
But to do the questions, you have to be on Facebook Live.
But you have to be on Facebook Live to do the questions. So please join us. Send in a question. We have our sitting in for Evan Miller today is Reagan, and he is sporting that Publix
But you're
Publix
filling some
hoodie.
big shoes, though. Evan is a
Yeah,
darn
that's for
good
sure.
producer, but Reagan's no slouch.
Yes, we love having Reagan here. So he'll get us the questions if you send them to us. And today's
Reasonable
show is going to be
questions.
kind of just, Chris and I both love music. A little bit of my background, I spent over 30 years in the broadcast industry. In this area of Gainesville, one of my projects and companies was Wind FM, and it's classic rock station. We spent a lot of time doing that. Reagan, our engineer, is a huge classic rock fan, has over 700 albums in his record collection, and we spend a lot of time talking that. And I thought, what a great person to have here, other than Chris Qualmann, to discuss some of the leadership challenges that go on within the rock world.
And man, there are lots of them.
And so let's get into that discussion. First of all, tell us a little bit about your background as far as music is concerned, Chris, so that we can give some foundation to the discussion
Sure.
that we're going to have.
So I went to the University of Florida, both as an undergraduate, I was a journalism major, and as a law student. And I got very involved in the university's entertainment program. I was the producer of Gator Growl in 1979. And my passion was, still is, I loved the music business. When I was a student here, I was a student in 1975. That's dating me a little bit. When I was first a freshman, I'd go to these concerts on the Union lawn, and I would say to myself, man, I want to do that. I don't want to be the guy on stage, though. I want to be the guy booking those things. So starting immediately, I kept trying to knock on the door of Student Government Productions, the concert organization, and continuously, door got shut. But finally, when I was doing the Gator Growl thing, I got into the organization. Really, it was 77. I got into the organization as an assistant to the chairman. Then I became vice chairman, and then I became the chairman of Student Government Productions, the university's concert organization, from 1980 until 1983. And I just loved it. It was something I just was so passionate about. And fortunately, I had a team of people that were like-minded. I had staff members who just loved the concert business. And we had this interesting pocket of time because for years up until that point, there had been this guy, a faculty member or a staff member named Miles Wilkins, who went on to a very illustrious career in his own right. He was the guy overseeing the university's entertainment program for a long time as the student government accountant. But when he left to take a job as a theater manager in New Orleans, there was nobody really taking his place. So we students, to be blunt about it, it was kind of like kids in a candy store. We were doing it all ourselves. There was a guy before me, still a very good friend and very much my mentor, Thorpe Shuttleworth, who really took over when Miles left. And then I took over after Thorpe and did it for 3 years. We did the Eagles, Jimmy Buffett, Linda Ronstadt, Devo, Peter Frampton, the Allman Brothers Band, U2. We played them on their first American tour for $750. We booked them in this little club called the Rathskeller. Many of you out there might remember the Rath, as it was affectionately called. And it was in the daytime, just a student cafeteria where UF students would go with their meal plan tickets and eat lunch. But in the evening, it was sort of a beer hall, like a German-themed beer hall, and we started doing concerts there. And before my time, even in the early 70s, Tom Petty's first band, Mudcrutch, played there. The Allman Brothers played there when they were very, very young. And then when Thorpe became chairman, he did some bands there, and I continued that. And like I said, U2, on their first American tour, we paid them, I still have a copy of the contract, $750.
Well, let's talk.
Same four guys.
Let's talk about that. That is the crux of what I want to discuss here. So your background lays the groundwork for what we're going to discuss as far as leadership in those groups. What was it like, and who did you deal with when you put that U2 show on?
It's a good question. I dealt directly with the band's agency, which is an agency called Premier Talent out of New York City.
Okay.
I'll never forget there was an agent I dealt with named George Quevedo who dealt with the college market. Frequently, actually every year, the University of Florida would go to this event called NACA, National Association of Campus Activities, and that's where you would meet face-to-face with agents. One of my best friends still to this day is a guy named Rod Essig, who used to run a little agency called Variety Artists. He's now the head of CAA, Creative Artist Agency in Nashville. But I met George Quevedo, and I'll never forget him calling me at home. He got my home number. You didn't have cell phones back then. And I was on a break, and he goes, Chris,
Did they have?
you need to book U2. They're going to be big, I promise.
Did they have like real phones back then, Chris?
They had real phones, but you had to dial on landlines or smoke signals or semaphore with the flags. Anyhow, in terms of leadership, though, I have to throw a shout out to my good friend Albert Tabadji, a concert promoter who helped put that together too. So Albert, if you're watching, you were involved in that also. It's interesting though, because I was in a position where, I was 23 years old, but I had to act with, the savvy and knowledge of somebody with a lot of experience. And again, I don't just attribute that to my own acumen. I had some great people on my staff as well. Mm-hmm. And I made a point of putting people on the staff. We weren't all the same. I have this thing where I have on my wall, I love the misfits, the eccentrics, the artists, the dreamers, the thinkers. Those were the kind of people I put on my staff, all of whom had one thing in common, a passion for the music business. One of the guys, Scott Zeiger, went on to this illustrious career as a Broadway theater producer. Bob Klaus is now a building manager in Durham, North Carolina. So we all had people who loved the music business. And, you and I were talking before we went on the air. Back in the 60s and 70s, back in the psychedelic era of rock and roll and really the infancy of what eventually became such a huge multi-million, if not multi-billion-dollar business, you had managers who were actually as flamboyant, if not more flamboyant in some cases, than the artists themselves. I mean, think about it. You had people like Bill Graham, the legendary concert promoter from San Francisco, who ran Winterland Productions. He not only produced concerts, he managed bands like Santana and many, many others, the Steve Miller Band. He was involved in the Grateful Dead early on. And he was as much of a personality as the bands were themselves. Very boisterous, somewhat of a bully even. You have people like Irving Azoff, still very involved in the business, but he managed the Eagles and Jimmy Buffett and all these West Coast, a very boisterous personality. Peter Grant with Led Zeppelin.
So those individuals managed the group.
They did.
Yet the product, Chris, was still the group. And that's where I'd like to pick your brain as far as the leadership within that. Because it's almost like a holding company in corporate America. The managing company is the holding company.
Exactly, in many ways. Yeah.
And yet it's still the product that is in the community that makes that. A little bit of my thought process on that. Let's go to the Beatles for a second.
Sure.
A fairly well-known group. They had a nice little run of about 5-6 years from about 64 to 1970. What people don't realize then is, and I didn't realize it until I read about it, was when the Beatles broke up, the oldest Beatle in the group, which was John Lennon, was 29.
They were still very, very young.
The youngest Beatle in the group, which was George Harrison, was 26. These young 20-year-olds were responsible for $1 billion, which grew to $1 billion entity.
Still is.
Sure, they had, Epstein and George Martin and all of the other producers.
Alan Klein.
And everybody else. They had these people in their lives. Those were the adults.
So if I can interject at that point.
Sure, please, that's what I'm looking for.
To me, the most effective manager then and now are the ones who work strictly behind the scenes. That was the point I was making about some of the flamboyant managers. Peter Grant of Led Zeppelin, he was this giant man, physically as well as mentally and emotionally. He was a former pro wrestler, ironically, over 400 pounds, and he would go into venues, literally grab people sometimes physically. If he thought the promoter was cheating his band, or if he thought the building manager was, playing some funny games with the bills and expenses, he would grab them physically and beat them up. I'll give you an example. Ronnie Van Zant with Lynyrd Skynyrd. He was unofficially the band's manager in their early days.
Okay.
They had a manager named Peter Rudge, but that band needed leadership, and it was Ronnie, and he ran that band with an iron fist.
And that is the key, is the leadership.
And when he left, when he was gone, he died in the plane crash in October of 1977. The band didn't do anything for 10 years. They had the Rossington Collins Band for a few years, had a little bit of success, and eventually had the tribute tour in '87. But they did not internally have a leader like they did with Ronnie Van Zant, somebody with such a strong managerial personality. So they brought in managers. They brought in Bill Graham, who I mentioned earlier, Charlie Bresco, and others who managed the tribute tour. And actually, they still are going on to some degree to this day. But to me, the most effective managers are the ones you never hear about, are the ones who are strictly behind the scenes, not the Peter Grants, not the Bill Grahams, but the people like, I have a friend named Larry Jacobson. He's an entertainment attorney in Los Angeles. Larry manages a band called Avenged Sevenfold, which is a very popular hard rock band. You've never heard of Larry, but he does an amazing job for them behind the scenes. He uses the Carnegie principle, set a fine example for others to live up to. He knows that he has to be the adult in the room with dealing with these guys. There's a female by the name of Kristen Mulderig who manages the band Ghost. She also manages the heavy metal band Slayer. You've never heard of her. And she is a tremendous manager because she is a calming, steadying influence in dealing with multiple creative personalities. So to me, that is the most effective managerial style in the music business.
So that's a manager. We're here at Spurrier's Gridiron Grill inside the Coach's Podcast Room. This is MotivationU the Podcast. You can send us questions on Facebook Live. and Chris and I are getting into, Chris Qualmann from Meldon Law with me here today. Chris and I are getting into a discussion that hopefully I'll make Chris upset here in the next few minutes. Because
he could do that very easily. Not really. I love Bob.
Because we're talking about the difference between leadership and management. And yes, management is the process, and you need to have those people behind the scenes as the process. But it's my firm belief that a rock band or a country band is a company. It's
Of
an
course.
organization. And there has to be a leader of that organization, and it can't be a manager. Now, let me share. Let me share
Okay,
one
all
thing
right.
with you,
Let's hear your thought on this.
So your daughter just came off a long tour of
She did.
doing something with Jimmy Buffett, which was Escape from Margaritaville.
Right.
Or what?
My daughter is a touring Broadway singer, and she got a musical theater degree, and she just did a I think it was 24 city tour as one of the leads in the Broadway musical. It's the Jimmy Buffett musical, Escape to Margaritaville. So you're right.
Okay, so it brings me around to Jimmy Buffett. Jimmy Buffett surrounded himself with incredible managers.
He did.
I mean, he had managers everywhere. They managed everything, especially early on in his career. He was in the record industry. He was a record rep in Nashville when he first started. And then he, people like Jerry Jeff Walker and some other individuals that influenced him got him down to Key West, and the rest
there
was
you go.
success.
He no
right?
longer was a country singer. He was a Key West Margaritaville singer.
So a number of years ago, I had gone out to Las Vegas to see Buffett. MGM Grand. I always took my binoculars. I was with a big group of people, and I was sitting in the stands, and they were coming on for the encore, and I had my binoculars up to my eyes. And I see off, from my point of view, to my right, stage left from their view, stage right, a huge argument going on.
Oh, wow.
It was between Jimmy Buffett and Fingers Taylor.
Oh, wow.
And the two of them were very animated, almost to the point of physical, and they were right in each other's faces. And I turned to the folks that I was with, because we were all clapping and waiting for the encore to happen. And I said, something just happened between Jimmy Buffett and Fingers Taylor. When the band came out for the encore, there was no Fingers Taylor. He never again played with the band, and I think he sat in with Jimmy since then over those years. I talked to Fingers a couple of years later, or a year later, and met him through a friend of mine. And they used to make like $900 a show. And they wanted more money. But Jimmy didn't want to pay him. And Jimmy had little things like his microphone had to be so many inches in front of everybody else's microphone. The only microphone now that is up even close to being level with his is Mac McAnally's.
Sure. Great singer in his own right.
So that was the leader of the band. Forget the manager that booked them. Who was the guy that was paying the bills that put his
there's
name
two sides to a story like that. I tend to see it from Jimmy's point of view. You're right. It's Jimmy's the name on the ticket. He's the name on the marquee.
And that's the leadership side of it.
People aren't going to see Fingers Taylor. Great as he was, amazing harmonica player. I'll never forget when we played them in the Florida Gym. Fingers Taylor and Deborah McCall, the singer, they would come out and he'd play on the harmonica and she would sing. They would do some things on their own. So tremendously talented guy, no doubt about it. However, I would agree with you that Jimmy's the name on the marquee, and what he says goes.
Well, it's that, and that's the point of this discussion is how do they formulate? I mean, look at Springsteen. You and I are both huge Springsteen fans, okay? You read his book, Born to Run, or it's actually, give a plug to the book. It's better to listen to it because it's incredible to hear these 18 hours of stories in his own voice, which is really an awesome book to listen to. But when you listen to that and you hear the late 70s section of when they weren't, they didn't know what to do. I mean, so in the late 70s, 78, he was 28, 29 years old. The band was a little bit younger than him. Clarence was a little bit older. None of them were paying taxes.
Oh, I could imagine.
They didn't know what to do.
Well,
and he was a young guy. I mean, it was not Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band on the contract. It was Bruce Springsteen. He was a single artist. He had a band. That's the way and he paid these band members per show. Now it's an incredible thing to...
Well, there's a lot of moving parts that go into this. First of all, until the early 2000s, the way the music business worked is that people made money by selling product, by selling records. So let's use Bruce as an example, Bruce Springsteen. He would make the majority of his money, probably 95% of his income, from selling millions of albums. And there are several income streams that flow from that. He gets an artist royalty from the record company, from Columbia Records. He would get songwriter royalties by virtue of being the writer on every single song. Mm-hmm. So he made millions on every single album based on sales, based on airplay, based on publishing royalties. Back then, the concerts were more of a loss leader. Concerts were used back then to promote the albums.
Correct.
Now it's the other way around. With streaming going on, with peer-to-peer sharing and all these things that happened, now artists don't sell near the amount of product that they used to, but they make more money touring. So that's why the ticket prices are more expensive. And it's also why almost with every artist now, from little to middle-sized to big artists, they have these VIP experiences where you not only have the choice to buy a ticket, you can buy a VIP experience where you can get a sort of a temporary backstage pass. You go to a meet and greet. You can get your picture taken with the artist for several $100s. So the point I'm making is that back then, it wasn't unusual for an artist like Springsteen to pay his band members close to an equal share of what they got for the artist fee to play, because Bruce made so much money selling the records. If they played on the albums, they just got session fees. They, generally speaking, they didn't share in the royalties unless maybe they helped write a song, which was very rare in the case of Springsteen. But the story you just gave, okay, about Fingers Taylor and Jimmy Buffett, Bob, that story has played out hundreds, if not thousands of times.
And that's that key.
It has happened so many times in the music business.
So we're talking about two artists right now, Buffett, Springsteen. Mm-hmm. They had to hire the bandmates, which they had to pick the people that were going to play their music. So they had to hire those. Plus, they got to manage, coach, and follow. I mean, in Springsteen's band, they stayed together until a couple of them passed away, right?
Yeah.
But still, when you hear the stories that you had to chase people down and make sure they weren't doing drinking, or that they were sober for the concerts, and all of the things that go on to put on a show, we don't see that as fans.
We don't. And I think Bruce, again, I don't know if he ever took Dale Carnegie or not, but I think certainly one principle that he lived up to is setting a fine example for his band members to live up to. You don't ever hear about Bruce Springsteen. Well, he did get the DUI, but that's something that happens to people, and he dealt with it professionally and appropriately. He acknowledged his mistake, and life goes on. However, certainly you look over the longevity of his career, Bruce isn't somebody known for doing drugs or drinking too much or getting in trouble, getting in fights at bars and whatnot. He set a fine example. You gave me the example, I think, a couple of months ago. You sent it to me and Carrie, and it was a great story. You were talking about how the big man, Clarence Clemens, passed away, and it's his nephew, right?
Yep.
That now plays saxophone in Bruce's band. An incredible story. And you shared how at a certain concert, it might have been the first concert that he did, the young man stepped out to the stage and Bruce stepped back and let this young man go into the spotlight. Mm-hmm. That's being a darn good leader, and that probably exemplifies several Dale Carnegie management principles. Not everybody is as good a manager with his band as Bruce Springsteen obviously is. Ronnie Van Zant, in his own way, was. He may not have done it
Iron
with
Fist.
It was Iron Fist, right. It wasn't, the soft, gentle, kinder, gentler nature that maybe some people do. But these were guys from the west side of Jacksonville. They were tough guys who grew up tough, and Ronnie was the leader. He was the unquestioned leader. My son, I have a son, Benny Qualmann, who's the leader of a band right now, and he and I have conversations like this. He's a leader of a band called With Some Friends, and you have to make tough decisions as a leader. I talk to him, the same way I might talk to another band, because one thing we didn't mention is after I stopped doing the concerts and after I graduated law school, I practiced entertainment law for 24 years. And I represented, the reason I keep bringing up Lynyrd Skynyrd is because I represented some members of Lynyrd Skynyrd. I represented the band Matchbox 20. Perfect example of what we're talking about. Rob Thomas, the leader, the guy that made all that money from, the Grammy Award-winning song Smooth with Carlos Santana. I represented Rob Thomas on his first publishing deal and on their record deal along with my partner.
So his individual his first individual publishing deal.
Well, yes, he did have an individual publishing deal separate from the record deal with EMI Music. The point I'm making, though, is he had the same type of story in a different way that you just told the audience about Fingers Taylor and Jimmy Buffett. Without going into all the weeds of it, he had a few former band members from a former band he was in, and they got into a dispute as to who really was in charge, who was the leader. I won't go into the whole mess, but it eventually resolved itself. Rob was the leader of the band, and it had to be that way. He was the face of the band, the songwriter, the singer. He was the guy that really was the driving force behind it. And every band has this issue, no matter who they are, no matter where they are. It's a tough thing that has to be worked out case by case.
And usually these people are very young. I mean, we're talking about young people that get into the music industry. They're not in their late 30s, 40s, or 50s when they have to make these decisions. I think of back in the early 1960s, I think of Dave Clark. Dave Clark from the Dave Clark Five, just one of the pioneers in hanging on to his own music. Dave Clark, he was a young 20-something, maybe 20, 21, maybe 19, 20, 21, and he made the decision, and I think it was 1964, that he was going to own his own music. And he was the drummer of the band. He wasn't even the lead singer, which the lead singer tends to be the person. And it was really interesting how this young man was able to make that decision, have
Somebody
the intestinal
gave him very
fortitude.
good advice.
Yeah, I don't know who gave him the advice, but he was a pioneer in that.
Can I give you a story that's somewhat analogous to that? Very analogous to that. So you remember the Beverly Hillbillies, the famous show, the Beverly Hillbillies. Yeah. And I think to this day, it is on somewhere in the world every single day of the year. Only one actor in that show, had the foresight to negotiate a royalty for reruns and repeats and replays of the show. That was, of course, the star, Buddy Ebsen, who had some experience. Mm-hmm. Now that's a standard thing in SAG, Screen Actors Guild contracts, but it was not back then. He was the only one who thought, you know what, maybe this corn pone show about a bunch of hillbillies is going to be a hit. So he insisted that it be put in his contract that he get a royalty every single time that show replays anywhere in the world. Now, obviously, he passed away a number of years ago, but it means his estate to this day still gets a royalty from that. So you're right. Your point's an excellent one. There's a reason they call it the music business. It's a business.
And for our audience, and we're going to take a break here in a couple of minutes, but for our audience, the point that I wanted to roll this out with is that there are certain things that we interact with on a daily basis, be it sports, be it music, be it news broadcasting, newspaper, whatever it is, walking into the local grocery store, a Walmart. There are leadership practices taking place all the time.
Certainly.
And what can we learn from the things that happened, in the past? And how can we take, that thought process and use it in our life? Because I'm a firm believer that the greatest leaders in the world are not on a huge stage. They're working in our communities.
That's right.
They're interacting with your children, my children. They may be my children or your children. Who knows? But the people that are influencing other people's lives, that's what I want to touch into. And so much we can learn from the history of just music to see that happen.
We'll definitely talk more about that after the break, but there's so many examples of it. As I think I've told you, all four of my children at one time or another have been in the entertainment business. My oldest son is now a law enforcement official. However, I have triplets who are 24 years old. We talked about my daughter, who's the touring Broadway singer, one of my sons, who's the singer of a rock band, and I have another son who is a music producer and engineer who's an extraordinarily trained musician in his own right. And I give them this speech about how important it is to be a leader, to be a business person, and that if you work with an ensemble of people, to set a good example. I said it to my son Benny the other night. They had a concert down in Orlando, and I said, you need to be gracious to your audience. You need to thank the promoter, thank the venue, thank your band members, and he did those things. And so these principles are being used, like you said, in all aspects of life.
Well, we're going to come back to that. I'm sitting here with Chris Qualmann from Meldon Law, and also plethora of experience in the music industry. And we'll be back right away. This is MotivationU the Podcast.
We still hear it. The sound of victory. The joy of being part of something great. And while things may not be the same right now, we haven't gone anywhere. If you bleed orange and blue, then Meldon Law is the firm for you.
Looking for more reasons to celebrate? We have them here at Celebration Point. Enjoy some of the newest additions to our already celebratory lineup, like Dave & Buster's, Les Macarons, and Prime and Pearl. There's always a reason to celebrate. Join us anytime for any occasion. Celebration Point, where Gators come to celebrate.
Hi, Steve Spurrier here. You know, making a reservation at my restaurant is easier than a Saturday afternoon homecoming game against Vandy. You don't have to call or email. Just go to spurriers.com, hit the reservation button, pick a date, a number of guests, and a time. It's so simple, I can do it. In fact, I just did. Maybe I'll see you tonight.
Welcome back to MotivationU the Podcast. My name is Bob Ganzak. My guest today, Mr. Chris Qualmann from Meldon Law. We're talking about leadership in the music industry and the differences between these young kids who you know,
They have to grow up quickly.
Yeah. We look back on it. We were just discussing on the break the Beatles again, and we look at those individuals. John would have been 81 this year.
He would have. That's right.
And so we think of them as these older folks, but we don't think of them as the 22, 23, 24-year-olds that they were when they built their business. And the personalities and the distinctions between them. You said something to me earlier about the incredible personalities and what it took to be a star. You know, what has to be on the inside is not always the greatest attributes to be a leader. So how
That's
did
true.
these, sure they had mentors and everything else, but really when it came down to it, there was 4 dudes in the Beatles. How did they get rid of the fifth? How did they get rid of
Pete Best when he
Pete
was
Best.
the original drummer?
Or he dropped out basically on his own.
It's not much different from how bands today, 50 years later, are still existing. Again, I use my son's band with some friends, and there are many, many others, thousands of millions of examples. Young kids getting together, 4 people. You have a guitar player, a singer, a bass player, a drummer. Maybe you add a keyboard player. Maybe you add another guitar player. And they don't realize until they have to realize it that what they've done is they formed a business. They have formed, if there's no other term for it, if they haven't incorporated, if they're not an LLC, they are at the very least a general partnership. And as a partnership, you have certain obligations to each of the partners. Let's go back to the Beatles example. You had John Lennon, Paul McCartney, who were the obvious leaders of that band because they were the primary songwriters. They were the primary singers. Now, some people have been telling me I should watch this documentary, Get Back. I haven't seen it yet.
Neither have I.
I'm going to watch it very soon. I know there's a scene in there, though, when George leaves the band, and it's actually captured on camera, where he says something like, well, I'm leaving now. And one of them says to him, what, you're leaving for lunch? Or you're going to be back tomorrow? No, I'm leaving. I'm leaving the band.
Which was the youngest person in the group.
That's right. And obviously they were faced with a leadership quandary. I mean, how are they going to deal with this? Now, I'm told that they convince him to return eventually, but it's a perfect example of what you're trying to say, of what you are saying, is that bands have managerial issues within them, not just their issues with their external managers.
But, they also, I mean, sure, the record company helps them choose that, but
Right.
like in these young men's, they basically own the record company. I mean, it was...
Yeah, they eventually did. I mean, they eventually had so much money, they formed Apple Records. And by that point, they had Alan Klein involved as their business manager. And even after the dissolution of the touring recording group in the early 70s, Apple Records continued as an entity. They had George Harrison as a solo artist. They had Badfinger. They had a bunch of other artists who, for a number of years, did pretty good business. And then even after that, of course, the Beatles
publishing
catalog it's insane.
Whole nother story
Whole
with
nother
Michael
story.
Jackson getting involved in that.
Yeah.
And
so the bottom line
so
is
some of the financial blunders they made as adults, not as
they
not
did.
as youngsters.
Irrespective of the internal management of a band, you have to surround yourself with competent representation, which includes a good personal manager, a business manager, an accountant, maybe who's separate from the personal manager. You have a booking agent whose job is solely just to book dates. You have publicists. You have a whole plethora of professionals who assist the band. But I do agree with you that even before you get to that point, internally, there has to be an understanding. There needs to be a leader. I'm very much a believer that you can't have, yes, you need a democracy. Everybody deserves a voice and a vote. Ultimately, though, there needs to be one person, somebody who is the one that gets everybody together, sets a good example, listens. I mean, that's an important leadership quality that Mr. Carnegie talks about, the ability to listen, the ability to be empathetic. That's not always easy, though, as you referenced earlier, because you're dealing with highly emotional, creative people who are artists in their heart. They've never thought about the fact that, oh my gosh, I'm now a leader, I'm a manager, I have to organize this band.
It's kind of a joke over the years,
Right.
But in reality, and when you go back to Springsteen, his nickname was the Boss.
He was the boss. There
Because
was no question
he
about
was
it.
the boss.
Well, let's talk about another example. Let's talk about the Rolling Stones, who sprung up.
Yeah.
They sprung up about the same time as the Beatles. Obviously, they went a totally different path. They still exist to this day.
Yeah.
They always, from day one, had an unquestionable leader, and that was, and still is, Mick Jagger, who, by the way, went to the London School of Economics. So that's something that's not very well known by the general public at large. But Mick Jagger
But he's still
did.
got to manage those personalities.
That's right.
And the Brian Jones, situation, and people leaving the band, and all of the things that happened. I mean, I mean, what have they been together for? 273 years now, I think.
274.
Yeah, I mean, because Keith Richards looks like that. And
Hey, if Keith is still alive, I have a good feeling about myself. 20 years from now. So,
my point is it's tough personality to.
Extraordinarily tough. And to my knowledge, I don't believe there is a quote unquote personal manager that represents the Rolling Stones right now.
You've never heard that.
I think Peter Rudge, who managed Lynyrd Skynyrd at one point, was involved with the Stones. They've had different advisors over the years, but it's basically been Mick.
Yeah.
Mick is the guy who has worn that mantle on his shoulders. I'll give you another example you might not know about. Led Zeppelin is still an ongoing entity to this day, and I talked about the fact that they had this
Even though they're not
gargantuan-
even together.
Right. Peter Grant, this huge, larger-than-life, individual who literally would physically beat up concert promoters if he thought they were ripping them off, was their manager in their heyday. Then Peter Grant passed away, and then, of course, Led Zeppelin, after the death of John Bonham, stopped being a touring and recording entity. However, the business goes on. I know Bill Kerbishley, who managed The Who, was helping them for a while. Basically, Jimmy Page runs the affairs of that band now. Jimmy Page, I read an interview with him where he said, I go to work every day. I said, I go to an office and I manage the business affairs of Led Zeppelin. They make, licensing deals with merchandise companies. There was an automobile company that had one of their songs on it. Jimmy Page, with the assistance, I'm sure, of some lawyers and advisors, made that deal. So there always is one person, and he was really that person at the beginning because he was the guy in the band that had the most experience. Robert Plant was just a 19-year-old kid who was invited by his best friend, John Bonham, to come to an audition. Jimmy Page was the guy that had been in the Yardbirds. He had been a session musician. John Paul Jones had a lot of experience as well, but Jimmy was always the unquestioned leader of Led Zeppelin, and still to this day is the guy that runs their affairs.
Yeah, that's so. How do they manage each other though?
It's not easy, I'm sure. I'd love to get a real off the record, honest answer from Jimmy as to how that's worked over the years, because he had lots of personal demons himself.
But I was never a huge Led Zeppelin fan, but they were also on the cutting edge of that initial heavy metal type thought.
Prog rock, that whole, having a voice like Robert Plant's who could scream. You had the one incredible guitar player, virtuoso, and you had John Bonham who played drums like a lead instrument, literally.
What people don't realize is that some of us that spent a lot of time going to concerts is there was not always a guarantee that you were going to show up to a concert and they were going to play good.
That's true. That is true.
Many a times they were pretty poor, and mostly the reason of that, I feel, was a leadership void, because they didn't have, somebody got too much substance into them that they couldn't play.
You said that very...
I was very careful.
Very PG-13, how you said that.
Yeah. Because, a lot of those, and the same things happen in our companies today. I mean, we go from being, in person to being virtual, to being back in person, to being back virtual, to being split. And you cannot regulate the performance that your team gives every single day.
You're absolutely right. And back in the day, I remember going to a Van Halen concert at the old Jacksonville Coliseum, where I loved the band, but David Lee Roth was wasted. He couldn't remember words. It was a mess. And then I saw them about 6 months later, and they were much, much better. You're right. There's I'm sure everybody out there has a story of seeing a band who wasn't exactly performing up to their best because of alcohol abuse or something else, whatever the case may be. But you're right. It requires internal leadership, internal management, somebody, at least one person, taking ownership of the fact that we are a business. This isn't just a fun thing we're doing. Yes, we're doing it because we're passionate about it. We love it. We write. We love the energy of the crowd, and it's a business. It has to be kept in that mindset.
And there's one of the things that when we go into that, if my sales staff, if I've got 8 people on my sales staff at Wind FM, let's say just from the radio station standpoint, and one of my individuals gets sick or goes on maternity leave or something happens, I have a choice to either bring somebody in and temporarily work in that individual, or pass those accounts on to other individuals to be worked with while this other person is out of the office. In a band, it's a rare occasion where if the organ player gets too drunk the night before and can't play, do you cancel a show? Do you do that? The only band that I know of that ever, brought that other person in, well, a couple that I think of, the Beach Boys, when Brian Wilson wasn't going to tour anymore, they hired Glenn Campbell.
They did.
And Glenn Campbell went on tour with them, played guitar.
Absolutely
the other
true.
was one of the things that I read about in the Eagles was, and I can't think of the guitarist named Don Felder.
Don Felder, he got
From
into the
here
fight
in
on
Gainesville.
stage with Glenn Fry. It's much like the story you talked about with Buffett and Fingers.
Yeah, that's a whole new story. The point that I was
Yeah.
talking about was when his children were born, he was going to be there, so they had somebody sit in and play guitar for the Eagles. When you can read about that in When Hell Freezes Over, his book. But but very rarely, I mean, like I remember seeing America, and back in the 70s.
Played him at the Florida Gym.
Yeah, back in the 70s at Pine Knob Music Theater outside of Detroit. And like the second song or third song of the night was Ventura Highway. And I don't know which one of the three of them did the opening for that on the guitar. But he broke a guitar string, broke another guitar string, broke a third guitar string, and
So
they walked off stage.
He's down to 3 at that point.
And well, they kept on replacing it. He
Yeah.
would replace it, and they would talk for a little while. And after he broke the third one, they walked off stage, and I think it was Jonathan Edwards was their opening. Like he came back out and played. I saw the guy's name Joe Cocker.
Okay.
And the band Montrose opened for them.
What a great
which was
band.
Sammy Hagar,
Ronnie Montrose,
yeah.
great band.
And Joe was a little bit too inebriated that night, so Montrose came back out and played more because Joe couldn't do his show.
see.
And it's rare occasions that happens. But think about that. We're talking about
one
young
occasion
people.
that
And how do you
happened?
lead those individuals?
When the Rolling Stones went through the whole issue with Brian Jones, he actually had quit the band and then died shortly thereafter. They had already booked this huge concert. They had booked this huge free concert at Hyde Park in London, and Brian Jones left the band. They got Mick Taylor, just like that, to come in and step in and play. So you're right. These are difficult situations. I think a lot of it has to do with how integral the musician is. If Jimmy Page couldn't play for a Led Zeppelin concert, there's no way they could go on. If Robert Plant couldn't sing, there's no way they could go on.
Oh, you were talking about Mick Jagger. I mean,
Yeah.
who made the decision in Ontario, California, to hire the Hells Angels to be their bodyguard?
It probably was Mick at the end of the
Right.
day, or it was something made in collaboration.
It's
I
a
think Bill Graham was
21-year-old,
involved. Yeah.
22-year-old kid making a decision that that we still talk about here in
We still talk
2021.
about, you're right. I mean, that's that movie, Gimme Shelter, is an epic concert documentary. I'd urge people to check that out. You can see the whole thing going on with the Hells Angels at Altamont and all of that.
So what's the difference between running a business here now? I mean, there's investment, there's somebody that has to be the leader, somebody that has to make the decisions. I mean, take Meldon Law. Jeffrey and Carrie are the partners in the law firm. And there's a lot of responsibilities. Not only is he the lead singer, all right, to use an analogy, right? Jeffrey's the lead singer
He's the business
of the
manager,
band. He's the business manager. He's also the decision maker, along with Carrie, to make the decisions. And you guys,
it's a tremendous amount of responsibility. That's an excellent analogy, because one thing we're trying to do is, get Jeffrey to where he doesn't have to be involved in the day-to-day practice and focus more on the marketing and focus more on the business. I know that's what he wants to do. Still, Jeffrey, you've got to know him pretty darn well. Over the past couple of years, he loves the practice of law. He's passionate about it. And so I don't think Jeffrey will ever completely divorce himself from the day-to-day practice of law. Still, though, you're right. That's an excellent example that you have to, while at the same time be involved in the creative aspect, the production aspect, you have to manage, supervise, and be completely on top of the day-to-day business aspect. One thing I wanted to also tell you is if you think managing rock stars is challenging, I represented professional wrestlers for a point in time in my career. And partly because, I'll admit it, people who know me very well know that I'm a lifelong fan of pro wrestling, but there was a period of time as an attorney where I represented pro wrestlers. I handled their deals with the respective companies they were working with. I handled their employment agreements, merchandising agreements, anything that came as a result of what they were doing in the ring. Same thing as with a rock band. I would have to sit these guys down and grab them by the shoulders and literally say, you're a businessman, okay? It's not just going in the ring and doing your flips and jumps and kicks and punches and this, that, and the other and having fun and then going in the back and shaking the hand of the guy you just beat up. You know, you have to treat what you do as a business. And it's very challenging with guys and even women, you know, who have worked in that type of, you know, a high pressure environment for such a long time to realize, hey, I'm a business person, or I'm a business, I'm a sole proprietor. I have to pay taxes. I have to, you know, manage my finances accordingly. I have to keep track of the supplements I need because that might be a business deduction from my income. There's so many things that go into any creative endeavor, whether it's wrestling, whether it's rock and roll, whether it's being a Broadway singer like my daughter or my other son who's the music producer. He and I talked about this recently. Charlie, he said to me a few months ago, is it a good idea that I should form an LLC? And I said, absolutely. You want to form a limited liability company so that you can, through the LLC, loan out your services as a music producer and as a music engineer. Same thing with bands. Bands need to realize they need to form some type of a business structure. Like I said earlier, if they form nothing, the law presumes you are a partnership because that is the legal definition of a partnership.
So that means if there's 7 people in the band, they're going to split everything 7 ways.
Well, unless you have an agreement that says otherwise.
That's what I said. If you do nothing, that was your point. If you do nothing, the law is going to assume that you are.
That's exactly right. The law would assume that, and you could, of course, bring evidence in saying, well, that wasn't really our understanding, but it's tougher, obviously. That's why we tell people the most basic advice I ever give is reduce it to writing. Get it in writing. If nothing else, if you don't have the funds to sit down with a lawyer, if you don't have the wherewithal or you're not far enough in your career yet to get a personal manager, have some written understanding among the 4 of you. Yeah, it can be, all right, we agree that we're going to split songwriting royalties the following way. We agree that we are going to split live concert performance income the following way. That goes back to your original point at the beginning of this podcast, is that you have to have leadership internally as a musical group.
Yep. And you're listening to MotivationU the Podcast, coming to you live from Spurrier's Gridiron Grill, inside the Coach's Podcast Room here at the beautiful Celebration Point. And
look at all these wonderful helmets.
Such a beautiful, looking out through the restaurant, over the bar and out into a beautiful blue sky. What a great day for a Gator victory, and we're going to bring that home tonight.
I think they will, honestly. I had my doubts because, as I told you during a break, I've been a big UCF fan. I admit it. While I'm a Gator through and through, I got my law degree here. I got my undergraduate degree here. I live in Gainesville. My kids know I'm a pretty darn passionate Gator fan. I like UCF too. I lived in Orlando for 26 years. I've always been impressed by the way, they've built that program from a Division II to now doing as well as they are. I know people scoffed a couple of years ago when they declared themselves national champs, but I was thrilled for them.
Yeah.
I thought that team could play with anybody in the country. So I think, though, we're going to have the advantage tonight because their quarterback, Dylan Gabriel, isn't playing. Our quarterback is playing. We've got Damian Pierce, who I think is as fired up as I've ever seen him. So I expect a good night for the Gators this evening.
And when we get back to leadership, there's another situation. Sports, the things that we're going through right now, sports is the entertainment business. It's no different than music or publishing or newspapers, magazines, or whatever. Sports is an entertainment business, and it's attracting people to it. And what goes on, and more I see the success of teams, especially at the college level, having, yes, you have to have a great coach. Yes, you have to have the boosters and everything behind it. But it's the young men
absolutely
who kind of find that, and not necessarily having to be a quote-unquote alpha male, but kind of find that 1 or 2 individuals that push the team to the next level.
Let's talk about the 3 men whose busts are out in the front of Florida Field.
Yes.
Those 3 Heisman Trophy winners. Steve Spurrier, Danny Werfel, Tim Tebow. Leaders through and through, yep. Each one of them not only were outstanding quarterbacks and football players, they were the unquestioned leaders of those teams.
One of the things that when I look at the 3 of them, just as you said that, is ego. 3 different types of egos too.
Very much.
And and that's something that's really important, because take 110 or 115 young men, because sure, there's 85 scholarships, usually like 93 to 100 people on the team, but when you look at it, the other individuals that are there that are still part of the team, you got like 105, 110 young men, college age people, that you're putting on your shoulders. And sure, you get the accolades for being the person out front, and now you get paid. When they played, they didn't get paid for that. Maybe they got paid.
They sort of do now, but no, anyway,
yeah.
with the NIL deals and whatnot.
That's what I mean. Now
Right,
they do.
okay, yeah.
Now they do. But back when they played, those guys didn't get.
No,
But it was how do you push yourself to that front? What are the things that make a Mick Jagger? What are the things that make a Jimmy Buffett? What are the things that make a Danny Werfel?
I think there's something internally within them where they come to the awareness, the realization they are wired to lead. They know that they have talent. They know that they have a certain skill and acumen that makes them perhaps a little bit different, a little bit above and beyond the others. Each of them in their own ways came to realizations that it takes more than skill. It takes more than being a great quarterback, a great songwriter, a great guitar player. I need to lead, because if I don't do that, my business will fail. I will not make as much money. I won't be able to feed my family as well. Tim Tebow, the one who's certainly the most recent, what a leader, of course. We think back to his speech that he gave, after the promise he made after that Mississippi loss, his Heisman Trophy year. Can you only imagine how the rest of the team reacted to that? They would have run in front of a train for that guy. They knew that this guy was not only the quarterback, the starting QB, the star. They knew that this guy had a passion in his heart for the team as a whole. And you're right, the personalities were different. I know Danny Werfel was certainly that way. I was too young to know really what kind of a leader Steve Spurrier was. I was 9 years old when he won the Heisman Trophy in 1967. Still, I look at him now, and I look at him as a coach, and I think about the leadership qualities he exemplified. Each of those three guys knew that it took more than just their skill and talent, as whether it's a quarterback or as a coach. It took leadership skills. And they had to show that and show these principles, when they did their respective things.
When I think about, you mentioned Coach Spurrier, and not because we're sitting inside of his restaurant necessarily. One of the things he told me when he was on this podcast with me, which was the second podcast we ever did, I think this is number 20 or 21 now, the second podcast we ever did, he told me that a key change in his coaching life came when he decided to listen to the guys that were on the field.
Wow.
And he told the story that happened at Duke, which I won't go into here, but actually he took the advice of one of the players on the field, and it's that ask questions instead of giving direct orders standpoint. So that tells me a lot about him. And going back just quickly to the music side of it, we look at things that happen, like Springsteen losing his music catalog and then fighting for it, not being able to play for 2 years or record for 2 years in the 70s.
With Mike Appel, his former manager, right?
And now, in the last 10 days, he sold his music catalog to Sony Records
$500 million
for $500 million. So, were those 2 years worth it now? I would think so.
Absolutely, and that's also a great example of somebody not having good representation at the beginning of his career.
Yeah.
He signed.
Thank goodness for John Landau.
That's right.
Yeah.
He signed that horrible deal with his original manager, Mike Appel. I'll give you 20, 30 seconds on this, and you know this already. He signed away everything because as a young musician without any business savvy, all he cared about was the music. He just signed on the dotted line, and he signed away everything to this guy, Mike Appel. And then after Born to Run, was the multi-zillion seller platinum album he's wondering, why am I not making more money? It's because he signed away the majority of his rights to this guy. So you're right. Thank God John Landau stepped into his life and got him some representation. And they fought that thing. He had a whole team of outstanding New York lawyers. They fought that thing. They resolved their deal with him, and look at him now.
Yeah. Chris, I appreciate you being with us here today. It's been fun for me to sit here and just talk music with you.
Well, we could go on for a long time.
For a long time. We only have 1 hour. That's
right.
that's
Well,
a challenge.
Very honored that you had me on. I really, from my heart, thank you very, very much, Bob. I, too, consider you to be a mentor, a friend, and we're not here to necessarily plug it, but I'm going to anyway. If you're watching this and you haven't taken the Dale Carnegie course, we start up again in January.
January 25th.
And this guy in the course has helped change my life and the lives of many others in Meldon Law. We've had, how many people now have taken the course? 7, 8. I'm not sure exactly what the number
Including,
is.
Including Jeffrey's wife.
Jeffrey's wife. Jeffrey himself took it last term, and I can't say enough wonderful things. I have kids out there who don't know that they're going to take the course, but that's what you are.
I've got some surprises coming up for the last show of the year next week. So next Thursday, we will be having some fun. From the Coaches Podcast Room at Spurrier's Gridiron Grill, for myself, my friend Chris Qualmann, our producer, Reagan, this is MotivationU the Podcast.